Well, welcome to another slightly boring video. So, in part of my quest to figure out this whole middlebrow conundrum, I picked up this book, Near Neighbors by Molly Clavering, which is part of Dean Street Press's very aptly named Furrowed Middlebrow imprint, which essentially brings back into print a lot of early to mid 20th century British women writers, typically the ones who fell below the criteria for Virago modern classics, for example. So I'd been wondering for a while, what are these books? Where do they stand? What are the levels of quality? Because by and large, I think my immersion in Anglophone women writers of the mid 20th century in the last 4 or 5 months has been very firmly with writers who are extremely good. There's this Elizabeth Bowen who towers over all the rest, but then Muriel Spark, Elizabeth Taylor, Edna O'Brien. None of these are anything less than very, 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 very good writers. And even though I had perhaps rashly, as a slightly younger man, seen titles by Spark and O'Brien and Taylor and dismissed them as well, this is probably going to be fairly tame, tepid material. I'm finding that it's very far from that, because it's the excellence of the writer that brings to bear on any subject matter that counts, right? Because that is why some people are novelists, that they have a sensibility, that they have thoughts, and both an engagement with the form of the novel and with the form of the world around them that needs to be put out. So I thought, is there really such a thing as middlebrow or lowbrow anymore, actually? And this little book has helped me a lot, because it's charming. It's about a shy, uncertain, lifelong spinster who, after her domineering elder sister passes away, starts slowly making friends with the family next door, who have four daughters and one son, and the widow mother, and slowly they become part of her life. She becomes part of their lives. Everyone is happier in the end. It could have been an intriguing situation. It could have been a funny situation, but there really isn't much humor. Miss or Mrs. Clavering is not interested in humor. There may be a little bit of dialogic, typical supposed humor with the youngest daughter. Holly is shown as being very headstrong and full of herself, and taking her parents, her mothers and siblings' gentle admonitions to her overly to heart. But there isn't anything funny as such. None of the situations are particularly crazy. None of the writing is especially witty. And what I find defines this, a couple of things that to me define this as of very, very, very middling abilities and ambitions, is that the characters are a couple of traits. This is especially true with the sisters, who are all named after trees. So there's Rowan, who's Red Rowan. There's Hazel, who's Witch Hazel. There's Willow. There's Spiky Holly. And that's it. The traits remain pretty static. The only growth might be towards happiness and towards a more mature sense of responsibility. There is very clearly a norm of how you should be that Clavering slowly moves those characters who need to be moved in that direction towards. One of the few interesting characters is a boy, a young man who is a possible love interest for one of the daughters. He is an orphan who was adopted by a very conventional family, but there's a wild streak in him. He's an accomplished Highland dancer, but he's got a chip on his shoulder. But this character is sort of conveniently hived away and found a happy ending of his own, but surely he can't be part of this lovely bourgeois family that this book centers on. But you know, there is a personal growth for him, and he's obviously going to be okay with his kind, which he's found. But his kind and our kind, you know, are very different. And this book just consistently seemed to ignore the more interesting characters, and the few interesting characters are the negative ones, like the long dead, the just died sister, the very imperious one, who basically married a man, immediately left him, was a spinster for the rest of her life, well, lived as a spinster for the rest of her life, to the extent that people thought she was a widow and not that her husband was actually alive. The one who dominated her poor sister Dorothy, and whose shadow Dorothy breaks out of over the course of this novel. It's so interesting to think of this character, this very self-righteous, this very strict and harsh woman who spent virtually just one night with her ne'er-do-well husband and then left him for the entire rest of her life. I would have been more interested in her. It could almost have been a strangely Miss Havisham in reverse-like character, but Clavering isn't interested in that. She dispatches her, you know, before the book even begins, so that instead we can see Dorothy come into her own, which also could have been interesting. And it's touching, it's charming, but there's little more to it than being touched and charmed. There isn't really more to it. Everyone in the book kind of winds up being sensible and making the right decisions, and there's no particular reason for it except that Clavering feels that, you know, there is a social order, and while it doesn't have to be stodgy and stiff, it is quite sensible, and all the sensible good people that she's created as characters will eventually find their place in it, and it'll be to the betterment of everyone. So really there's no interest in going beyond what one knows, what one has been taught to accept. The writer herself doesn't see much of vistas beyond this cozy, cozy and laid out, conveniently structured for you by society kind of life. So perhaps part of what defines something as middlebrow is the lack of a larger vision. I think a really interesting work of art must somehow be struggling against limits, and this book does not do that. And by and large, a piece of work that isn't struggling against limits is perhaps boring. Anyway, I read this, Eva Trout by the magnificent Elizabeth Bowen soon afterwards, and wow, it was her last completed novel, and her style is almost, I don't know, it's baroque, it's at the very limits of its development. The sun lounge plastered along the southern front of the dining room had been so very unfortunate in this matter that it now more resembled a charnel arbor. There was nothing to sit on in it, and no wonder. The double drawing room was furnished. Carpets and parquet were dotted with brocade-clad armchairs and sofas, trefoil-shaped tables and standard lamps with tiltedly worn shades. You could see that everything had its history. Chairbacks wore grease-darkened circles where heads had rested, and chair arms, tables, and flooring not only were mapped by wandering stains, but abounded in small, charred troughs burned by cigarettes. In some other life, Eva had been shown a knocked-about doll's house. Had it not stood on a veranda somewhere, and knelt down to look deeply into its dramatic rooms? She had desired it. She was the more won over, consequently, by what was now round her, and the more elated. This she possessed. And it seems to me that this in miniature, and miniature of miniatures, what Bowen is doing. I think for Elizabeth Bowen, the world itself is that knocked-about doll's house that someone had once shown her, full of these dramatic rooms. And in her novels, she's creating her own little knocked-about doll's houses full of dramatic rooms and taking us into them. And neither she nor us are fully sure of what's going to be in there. And yet she's in control. She's in control, but she is not manipulating. She is the guide, not the puppet master, if that makes any sense. And now I'm reading A World of Love, a slightly earlier novel of hers, and there's something very interesting. Right in the first page, you see this very remarkable descriptive sentence. The sun rose on a landscape still pale with the heat of the day before. And at the beginning of the second chapter, there's an interesting sentence that echoes it. The land had not yet composed itself quite to sleep, for light was not gone and might never go from the sky, which is the evening before the morning of the first page. So let me read those two sentences to you in juxtaposition again. Bear in mind, it's the same landscape. The first sentence is a morning, and the second is the evening before. The sun rose on a landscape still pale with the heat of the day before. And the previous evening, the land had not yet composed itself quite to sleep, for light was not gone and might never go from the sky. Yeah. Okay, I'm just going to become inarticulate now and leave you with the thought that this is great writing. And it would take more words to explain what's great about it than it did just to read it out. Okay, that's all for now. The world is on the verge of World War III. Will Zelensky be Quisling, or is he Franz Ferdinand? Is India going to vote for the far right again in 2024? News at 8. Stay tuned for more. Bye, folks.